First, a brief history of how cannabis regulation has come to be in the United States. In 2012, Colorado and Washington State were the first jurisdictions in the world to create an explicitly legal and regulated supply of cannabis for adult use. In both those states and in all states to date, the legal age at which individuals can participate in the production and distribution of cannabis and also consume it for non-medical purposes is 21. In 2014, the states of Alaska and Oregon followed Colorado and Washington. 2014 was also the year in which Colorado and Washington brought their first legal supply online. So we actually haven't seen a legal and regulated marketplace in the United States until Colorado's stores opened in January of 2014 and Washington's opened in July of 2014. And then last November in 2016, as we were watching a shocking presidential election return, we also saw 4 states, California, Massachusetts, Maine, and Nevada, move to legalize and regulate adult supply of cannabis. California notably has a population of over 39 million people, and as John mentioned during the introduction, there are now more than 67 million, perhaps more than 68 million people in the United States of America who are living in a state that has legalized and regulated the production and distribution of cannabis for non-medical purposes, representing roughly 21% of our national population. In 2018, it is possible that the state of Michigan will also move toward legalization and regulation. That would add another 9.9 million to the total, bringing the United States population in legal states to roughly 24%, or almost a quarter of the United States of America. Cannabis production, distribution, and consumption, even for medical purposes, remains criminally prohibited under federal law in the United States. So how is it possible that the states are doing this? The United States, of course, is a country that lives under a federalist structure of democracy, meaning that the federal laws exist in parallel with the laws of the individual states. And the 10th Amendment to the United States Constitution ensures that our federal government can neither command the individual states to adopt state laws that further federal policies, nor can our federal government commandeer the policing resources of the individual states to either directly or indirectly enforce federal laws. And this is important because the overwhelming majority of criminal laws in the United States are in fact enforced by local policing agencies, local prosecutors, whether that locality is a city or a county or an individual state. It is a very small number of criminal cases that are investigated and prosecuted by the federal government. And within the context of marijuana offenses and criminal offenses, the overwhelming majority, roughly 99% of the arrests for marijuana use, occur at the local level. However, it's important to note that it's not simply the formal and explicit recognition of the 10th Amendment protections of the individual state's right to depart from federal law on cannabis regulatory matters. There's also a discretion that is inherent in the power of the states. There's a discretion that prosecutors enjoy. There's a discretion that policing agencies enjoy. How best to prioritize the use of their scarce public safety resources. Cannabis legalization, regulation, decriminalization, the medical cannabis movement all began in the United States of America at the very local level. In Washington State, you first saw cultural change happening through cultural events that were held in major metropolitan areas like Seattle that demonstrated to their communities that the use of cannabis in those communities did not cause significant public safety concerns, did not cause the kinds of significant public health concerns that animate most of the debate around cannabis regulations. And this percolated up. The city of Seattle in 2003 passed an initiative that made the adult use of cannabis its lowest law enforcement priority. And then we saw medical marijuana laws begin to be passed in California first in 1996, and then we moved forward toward regulation in 2012. The states in which the civil society organizations, the advocates who were trying to move reform forward, those states in which those advocates engaged with their local leaders, engaged with those who are responsible for the policing and prosecution of these laws, engaged in conversation with them about their concerns about safety, engaged with public health advocates about their concerns, about the increased risk of youth use, for example, and developed policies in collaboration, developed conversations and education in collaboration with those who were charged with the safety and health of their communities, tended to see a larger margin of victory in their ballot initiative campaigns. I think it is incumbent upon those of us that want to move these regulations forward that we move forward in good faith with those who have different views. And in fact, what happens is that policies are developed that better serve the concerns and needs of their communities. So now we have a new president, and there is much speculation about what his position on legalization and regulation is. Certainly his charming spokesperson has had interesting things and confusing things to say on the issue. I think what's important for us to consider is how sensitive the new president is to public opinion. And we have important data points, recently released national survey, February 23rd of 2017, that demonstrates that not only has the United States public opinion on the issue of cannabis increasingly moved in the direction of overall support, but also that the sentiment regarding whether or not the federal government should interfere in the implementation of laws in those states that have selected either a medical cannabis regulatory system or have moved toward full legalization and regulation is very strongly opposed to that interference. Some data points from this most recent poll: now 59% of Americans believed that the use of marijuana should be made legal in the United States. That includes 58% of independent voters, as well as 54% of women who have traditionally been more concerned about moving in this direction. Republicans still oppose full legalization by 61%. But when asked whether or not they would support or oppose the government in enforcing federal laws against marijuana in states that have already legalized medical or recreational marijuana, 55% of Republicans would oppose such federal interference with the implementation of those laws. 69% of women would oppose federal interference in the laws of the individual states. A total of 71% of Americans would oppose federal interference in the implementation of a state's regulatory laws for cannabis. So I hesitate to say this because I think we are constantly surprised by what is possible in the United States at this moment in time. But I do believe that states' decisions to move in this direction is not one of the highest priorities for our current federal administration. I think, as his predecessor would say, President Trump has bigger fish to fry at this moment. I do believe it's important, though, that the movement within the United States evolve from this place of ballot initiatives being the primary vehicle through which cannabis regulatory laws are passed. There are roughly half the states in the United States that have the ballot initiative as an available vehicle. But what we find in a representative democracy is that policies better hit that point of compromise in which no one is happy, but probably everyone is somewhat content with the result, if the policy moves through the legislative process and is impacted by the input of various stakeholders with various interests. Therefore, it would be my strong preference that we start to see a shift in the United States toward development of cannabis policies within state legislatures rather than written into a ballot initiative that is filed and can no longer be amended until the voters have an opportunity to vote on it and it passes. There are states that are moving in this direction. Vermont has been discussing full legalization and regulation for a number of years. Rhode Island, Connecticut. There are, in fact, 17 legislatures within the United States where bills have been introduced. And the legislators in those states are looking at the fact that last year Washington State realized $256 million in new revenue from taxes imposed on cannabis. And Colorado realized $200 million in new revenue from taxes imposed on cannabis. And those are taxes that can be used in Colorado for construction of schools, in Washington for public health, mental health, prevention, and treatment. And so I think we're going to see at the local level a greater interest in and embracing of the idea that the individual states can and should continue to move in the direction of imposing regulatory frameworks on an illicit market.